The moment my father laughed in court, it was soft, almost friendly, like this was all a misunderstanding he'd clear up before lunch. Lawyers leaned toward each other, whispering, confident, bored. My mother sat 3 rows back, gripping her worn leather purse so tightly her knuckles turned pale, her hands trembling in a way she couldn't control. I remember thinking how out of place she looked there, like someone who'd wandered into the wrong room and didn't know how to leave. When my father glanced at her, he didn't look angry or afraid. He smiled, and in that instant, I knew he believed she was finished. What he didn't know was that by the end of that day, everything he'd built his power on would collapse. That laugh didn't just echo through the courtroom. It lit something inside me I didn't know existed, something that refused to stay quiet anymore. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. That courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor cleaner, and the air felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for the same ending. The judge called the case, my father's name first, confident and familiar, like he belonged there. My mother's name came next, softer, almost swallowed by the room. She had no lawyer beside her, no stack of files, just a single folder she'd carried for years, filled with documents she barely understood. People noticed. I saw it in the sideways glances and the subtle shifts in posture. They assumed what people always assume when one side looks prepared and the other looks alone. What everyone in that room believed was completely wrong, but at that moment, I was the only one who knew the story didn't start there. Years earlier, before the court dates and the silence, before my mother stopped laughing the way she used to, our house in Ohio had been ordinary. Sunday pancakes, the smell of coffee, my father's voice too loud during football games. On the outside, he was respected, successful, the kind of man neighbors asked for advice. Inside the house, things were quieter, controlled by rules no one ever said out loud. Money was his domain, decisions were his, and my mother learned early that questioning him only made things harder. I didn't understand it as a kid, I just knew her shoulders tensed when his car pulled into the driveway. When she finally decided to leave, it wasn't dramatic. It was a single suitcase, a borrowed car, and a promise to herself whispered in the dark. The court case came months later, and by then my father was ready. My mother wasn't. Sitting there that day, watching him laugh, I wondered how many people in that room had already decided who deserved to win. And I want you to ask yourself now, if that were you sitting alone on that bench, would anyone believe you either? My father's control didn't start in that courtroom. It started years earlier, quietly, in ways that were easy to explain away if you weren't the one living inside them. He had money, real money, the kind that buys comfort, loyalty, and patience from other people. He owned a small construction company that grew fast, and with every new contract came more respect, more handshakes, more people willing to vouch for his character without ever seeing what happened behind closed doors. To the outside world, he was dependable, generous, solid. At home, he controlled the air we breathed. Bills were paid in his name, bank accounts were his, and questions about money were treated like accusations. My mother learned to ask carefully, then learned to stop asking at all. When she tried to work, he said it wasn't necessary. When she pushed back, he reminded her who paid for the house, the car, the life everyone admired. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted gratitude for it. Over time, he became the author of our family's story, correcting details, reframing arguments, deciding which memories mattered. If my mother cried, he said she was unstable. If she protested, he said she was ungrateful. Even I absorbed his version of events without realizing it, because it was repeated so calmly, so often. He controlled money, yes, but he also controlled silence. Friends drifted away after awkward dinners. Family visits became shorter. When my mother finally told someone what was happening, the response was confusion, not outrage. He doesn't seem like that, they said. And my father smiled, because he knew reputation can be louder than truth. By the time the divorce papers were filed, he already had lawyers lined up, statements prepared, and a version of my mother that made sense to everyone but her. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to erase her. Erase the years she raised me while he worked late. Erase the sacrifices no one saw. In court, his confidence wasn't loud, it was relaxed. He joked with his attorneys, nodded at familiar faces, acted like the outcome was a formality. My mother sat alone, every movement magnified by the absence beside her. No lawyer meant more than a missing professional. It meant humiliation. People whispered, not cruelly, but curiously. as if they were watching a puzzle piece that didn't fit. I could almost hear their thoughts. Why wouldn't she get representation? What did she have to hide? My father leaned back in his chair, arms loose, as if the room belonged to him. This was psychological warfare, not raised voices or slammed doors, but quiet signals meant to remind her where she stood. As the hearing dragged on, my mother's isolation became heavier. She fumbled with papers, apologized for speaking too long, and thanked the judge more than once, as if grateful just to be heard. Every interruption from my father's lawyer landed like a correction, reinforcing the idea that she was unprepared, emotional, unreliable. I watched her shoulders curl inward, the way they did at home when arguments went nowhere. And I wondered how many people sitting there had ever been slowly convinced that their voice didn't matter. Have you ever been in a room where everyone else seemed confident, and you felt yourself shrinking, even when you knew you were telling the truth? That's what he counted on. He believed time and pressure would do the rest, that she'd give up, agree to anything, just to make it stop. But what my father didn't expect was who had been listening to him for years. He didn't notice the child sitting quietly at the kitchen table, memorizing tones instead of words, patterns instead of promises. He didn't think about the daughter who learned early how stories could be bent, how facts could be rearranged without technically lying. While he controlled the narrative out loud, I learned the one underneath it. Every late-night phone call, every casual brag about handling things, every warning disguised as advice stayed with me. Sitting in that courtroom, watching my mother stand alone, something clicked into place. The whispers, the confidence, the laughter, they all depended on one assumption, that no one else knew how he operated. And that assumption was wrong. Growing up inside that house meant learning early that silence was safer than questions. I didn't see bruises or shouting matches the way movies show them. I saw pauses, looks, and the way my mother's voice changed when my father walked into a room. I was a silent witness to things adults assumed children forget, the late-night arguments spoken in careful tones, the way he'd lower his voice when talking about money like it was something dangerous. I saw documents spread across the dining table, bank statements slid back into folders when I came too close, letters folded and unfolded until the creases never went away. I overheard phone calls where he'd laugh softly and say things like, "She won't fight it," or "She doesn't have the means." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I understood how sure he sounded. I learned how power works by watching it, how it doesn't need to announce itself, how it just assumes compliance. And I wonder, if you grew up hearing the same things over and over, how much would you absorb without realizing it? What my father never noticed was that while he was shaping his version of reality, I was paying attention to the cracks. I studied how words were chosen, how facts were framed, how confidence could make weak arguments sound strong. Years later, when I told people I was studying law, I didn't make a big announcement. I just did it. I worked quietly in legal offices, filing documents, listening more than speaking, learning how cases are really built and lost. I learned where people cut corners and where they assumed no one would look too closely. Access to information changes you, especially when you know exactly what you're looking for. Every offhand comment my father made, every insult he threw at my mother about her ignorance, every moment he bragged about being untouchable, he unknowingly handed me evidence. Patterns matter in court. Timelines matter. Paper trails matter. Sitting there years later, watching him smirk across that courtroom, I wasn't angry the way people expect. I was focused, because everything he thought was harmless, every detail he dismissed, was about to matter. And ask yourself this: if someone underestimated you for years, what would you do with the truth once you finally had the chance to use it? By the time my father's lawyer stood to speak, the outcome already felt decided to everyone watching. He smiled as he talked, the kind of smile meant to signal ease, and made a quiet remark about the absence of opposing counsel that drew a few restrained chuckles from the gallery. It wasn't loud or cruel, just enough to land. My father smirked, leaned back, and crossed his arms, like a man enjoying a familiar routine. I saw my mother's breath hitch when she heard it, saw her blink faster as if trying to keep herself steady. Her fingers tightened around that same purse, the leather worn thin from years of use. And for a moment, I thought she might actually stand up and leave just to escape the weight of it all. Have you ever been so close to breaking that even small comments feel unbearable? That's where she was, balanced between staying upright and falling apart in front of strangers who had already made up their minds. Then the judge interrupted, voice firm but neutral, and asked a simple question that cut through the room. Was the respondent represented by counsel? The silence that followed felt longer than it was. My mother didn't answer right away, and no one rushed to fill the gap. Heads turned forward, then slightly away, as if avoiding eye contact made the moment less uncomfortable. The air felt thick, and my father's confidence settled into something calmer, satisfied. He believed this pause was confirmation, that the silence meant surrender. I looked at my mother, saw the doubt flicker across her face, the years of being told she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't fight back pressing down on her all at once. And I knew that if nothing changed in that moment, the story would end exactly how he planned it. That's when I stood up, that I didn't raise my voice when I stood, I didn't rush, and I didn't look at my father. I introduced myself calmly, stated my relationship to the respondent, and then, without drama, outlined my credentials. I said where I studied, where I worked, and why I was requesting permission to address the court. The room shifted in a way you can feel before you see it. Chairs stopped moving. Whispering died mid-sentence. My father's lawyer paused, confused, scanning papers like this version of events wasn't in his notes. My father didn't smirk anymore. He didn't laugh. He froze. For the first time that day, he looked unsure which expression he was supposed to wear. He had built his confidence on the belief that my mother was alone, and that belief had just been challenged. If you had been watching from the gallery, you might have thought this was unexpected, even inappropriate. But for me, it felt inevitable, like a door finally opening after years of pressure behind it. The judge looked at me for a long moment, not suspicious, just attentive, and acknowledged my request. That single nod changed the energy of the room. My mother looked up for the first time since we walked in. Really looked up, not at the judge or the lawyers, but at me. Her eyes widened slightly, like she was seeing something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. I saw confusion, relief, and fear all at once, and it broke something open in my chest. That was the moment his power cracked. Not because I spoke loudly or exposed anything yet, but because his control depended on silence, and silence had just ended. And I want you to think about this. If someone you trusted finally stood beside you when you thought you were completely alone, how would that change the way you saw yourself in that moment? I began with the part he always assumed no one would look at closely, the money. Not numbers thrown around to impress, but records, dates, transfers that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Accounts opened in my mother's name without her knowledge, funds moved just before filings, assets quietly parked under shell entities he controlled. I explained it slowly, clearly, like this wasn't revenge, just math. A paper trail doesn't care about charm or reputation. It only tells the order of events. The judge leaned forward. My father's lawyer stopped smiling and started flipping pages faster than necessary. I pointed out how my mother was denied access to funds she legally shared, how allowances were framed as generosity, how dependence was engineered over years. Financial abuse doesn't shout, it restricts, it isolates, it convinces you survival requires permission. As I spoke, I wondered how many people listening had ever had to justify their own spending, ever felt small for asking what was already theirs. Then came the messages. Texts saved, emails archived, words he never expected to be read out loud. Short sentences at first, instructions disguised as concern, then pressure, then warnings. If you fight this, it will get worse. You don't have the resources. Think about what you'll lose. I read them in the same tone they were written, calm, measured, certain. The courtroom felt tighter with each line. My father shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. These weren't emotional interpretations, they were his words, time-stamped, unedited. Threats don't always sound violent. Sometimes they sound reasonable, like advice from someone who knows better. I asked myself, and I ask you now, how many times have people dismissed warnings because they weren't loud enough to sound dangerous? When my mother was asked to speak, her voice shook at first, then steadied as the room gave her space it never had before. She talked about the years of confusion, about being told she was incapable, about how small her world became without her realizing it. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even my father couldn't hide it anymore, his jaw tight, his hands clenched, composure slipping in brief flashes of anger he couldn't fully control. And then the document even I hesitated to reveal came out. A single page, signed years earlier, that contradicted everything he'd claimed under oath. I paused before presenting it, feeling the weight of what it would change. Because once something like that enters the record, there's no walking it back. And in that silence, I wondered how many truths stay hidden simply because revealing them feels like crossing a line you were trained never to step over. I finally presented the document, the one he never thought anyone would find because he trusted time more than accountability. It was an agreement, signed and dated, that proved assets he claimed never existed were deliberately concealed long before the separation. The language was precise, unemotional, written by professionals who assumed it would stay buried. I explained how it connected to the earlier transfers, how it aligned with the messages, how it completed a timeline that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The judge took the paper, read it once, then again more slowly, and the change was immediate. His posture shifted, his questions became sharper, and the room felt different, like gravity had adjusted. This wasn't interpretation or accusation, it was proof. Undeniable, self-contained, and devastating in its simplicity. And I want you to think about this moment, about how often the truth exists quietly on paper while people suffer loudly, waiting for someone to put the pieces together. That was when my father broke. Not all at once, but in cracks that spread faster than he could control. His face flushed, his calm tone slipped, and frustration turned into anger he couldn't mask. He interrupted, objected without clarity, glanced at his lawyer for rescue that didn't come. Panic has a sound to it, even when no one raises their voice, and it filled the courtroom. People who had smiled at him earlier avoided his eyes now. His reputation, built carefully over decades, began to unravel in real time, not through gossip, but through record. And then, almost without realizing it, he laughed again. Not the confident laugh from the beginning, but a sharp, hollow sound that landed wrong. It echoed, just like before, but this time it didn't signal control. It signaled loss. In that mirror moment, the power dynamic flipped completely, and everyone in that room felt it. So I ask you, when someone finally faces the truth they spent years avoiding, do you think they recognize themselves anymore? The ruling came without theatrics. The judge spoke slowly, clearly, outlining how assets would be redistributed based on the evidence now on record. Accounts were reopened, properties reassigned, and financial control restored where it had been stripped away. There was no dramatic pause, just careful language that left no room for argument. My mother was vindicated not by sympathy, but by fact. The judge's final words weren't harsh, but they were firm, emphasizing responsibility, transparency, and the weight of sworn statements. My father stared straight ahead, jaw set, no longer reacting, like someone realizing too late that the story he told himself no longer mattered. When it was over, there was no applause, no visible relief, just a quiet shift in how my mother sat, shoulders easing, breath finally steady. And I want you to think about this. How often do people imagine justice as something loud, when sometimes it arrives in measured sentences that simply put things back where they belong? Afterward, the room emptied the way it always does, chairs scraping, doors opening and closing, people moving on to the next case. There was no shouting, no celebration, and no revenge waiting outside. My mother gathered her papers slowly, the same purse in her hands, but this time it didn't look like a shield. It looked like something she carried, not something she clung to. My father walked past without a word, smaller somehow, not because he was punished, but because the truth had been acknowledged out loud. Justice didn't raise its voice that day. It didn't need to. It stood quietly, in balance sheets corrected, in ownership returned, in dignity restored. And I'll leave you with this question. If the truth finally spoke for you, would you need anything more than the chance to walk away knowing you were seen? Justice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it stands quietly to eye in the months that followed. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. It became honest. I grew into the weight of what that day meant, not as a victory, but as a responsibility. I understood power differently then, not as control over others, but as the ability to listen, to prepare, and to stand when it matters. My mother began healing in ways that were almost invisible at first. She slept better. She spoke more freely. She made small decisions without apologizing for them. 6 months later, she took a job she'd always wanted, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she finally could. Watching her reclaim pieces of herself taught me that justice isn't just about outcomes. It's about giving people room to breathe again. And I want you to reflect on this with me. How many people around you are still carrying burdens in silence, waiting for someone to believe them? Power was redefined for both of us. It wasn't the money or the ruling. It was the quiet confidence that came from being heard and believed. There was no final confrontation, no speech delivered to my father, just distance, and in that distance, peace. The courtroom was never about punishment. It was about truth entering the record and staying there. So I'll ask you this. Do you think justice was truly served, or did it come too late? Let us know in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, hit like, It helps more people find stories that matter. Subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the most important ones are the quietest.